Hello, Namaste. Welcome to Dev's Hammer Show. This is the flagship weekly English talk shows of ITV Nepal and Indigenous Television. In this weekly television talk show, I try to bring the lessons, struggles, and experiences of Indigenous peoples from different countries, and I try to connect with one another. In this weekly talk show, I sometimes conduct face-to-face interviews, sometimes I conduct online video conferences and bring and discuss about various contemporary issues that Indigenous peoples are facing around the globe. In these episodes, I am going to discuss about the Indigenous peoples and their relationship with the conservations and ecosystems. It is estimated that 25% of the Earth land surface, which is owned, occupied, and managed by Indigenous peoples themselves. And Indigenous peoples' survival is impossible without land, natural resources, and the territory. This shows that Indigenous peoples play a crucial role in conservation of the environment and ecosystems. And it is therefore also said that Indigenous peoples are the custodians or stewards of the earth. And also therefore the international laws provision the state government have a responsibility to ensure that Indigenous peoples should not be evicted from their land and resources. But many cases from the very first creation of a state designated conservation areas in the globe shows different. For example, United States established its first protected areas called the Yellowstone Park in 1972. Subsequently, the Yosemite National Park in the year 1982, and the government violently expelled native communities living in or dependent on the resources in the areas. Similar instances have also occurred among the Baka of Cameroon, the Basarwa of Botswana, the Maasai of Tanzania, Tharu, Chepang, and among other indigenous peoples in Nepal, Karen indigenous peoples in Thailand, Jumas in Bangladesh, to name a few. State governments have often abused their powers by taking away resources from indigenous peoples. In this context, I have invited the international experts on conservations and their relationship with indigenous peoples. I have invited Minnie from Philippines. She is a member of the Kankanai Igorot indigenous peoples in the Philippines. Currently, she serves as a director of the Indigenous Peoples Program at the US-based nonprofit environmental organization called Conservation International. First of all, let me welcome to the show, Minnie.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. To start with our talk, Minnie, could you please introduce yourself and about the Conservation International, the organization that you are working with currently, in a brief, please?
I am Minnie Degawan. I am from the Cordillera Philippines, sa Kankanai Igorot. I am currently working with Conservation International as the director of the Indigenous Peoples Program. And aside from that, we are also working on inclusive conservation, which we are hoping to make conservation more responsive to the needs of people and while not violating their rights. So this is the work that I am doing with Conservation International.
Minnie, thank you so much for your introductions. As you are working for long in the conservation sectors, often it is said that the indigenous peoples have inseparable relations with the land, forest, and natural resources. If you have to say what sort of relations the indigenous peoples have with the conservation, environment, or ecosystems, why indigenous peoples cannot be separated from the said land, water, forest, and natural resources, and so forth?
Yes, Indigenous peoples are, we always say, one with the land. And I have also learned that they are also one with the waters. We also have to include our Indigenous brothers and sisters who rely very much on the waters. Simply because our survival depends on the waters and on the land. Even our culture derives itself from our relationship with the land. Our languages describe the features of the earth. And so if you are going to change the features of the earth, then even our language will have to be changed. The way we relate with each other, which is very, we are all related, we are relations, is because we recognize that we cannot on our own be working the land without the help of others. The survival of one is incumbent on the survival of the others, and our survival as a people is very much dependent on our lands, waters, and other resources. This is because we have started off as very self-sufficient communities. We produce what we need. We gather it from the forest or from the seas. We did not have that sense of dependency on other places. So we had to make do with what we can get from the lands and waters. And because of that relationship, we have come to look at the lands and waters as our relatives, as one with us. And this is something very different from traditional conservation. Traditional conservation looks at lands and waters as something that has to be fenced off, that is separate from people. Whereas Indigenous peoples would say, no, we are one. So when they say that people need nature, I always say, no, nature and people are the same. We are one. So what you do with nature, you do with people.
Minnie, as you are heading the Indigenous Peoples program in the Conservation International, could you tell us about the programs that you are undertaking to ensure that Indigenous peoples' rights over the natural resources and conservations?
Yeah, so as the director of this program, I have two main tasks. One is influencing CI so that they view Indigenous peoples as partners in their conservation work. So I need to educate CI on traditional knowledge, on how to relate with Indigenous peoples, and the importance of recognizing Indigenous peoples as rights holders. And then the second one is building the capacities of Indigenous peoples so that they can continue these discussions at the field level. I am based in Arlington, so I can only influence leadership here, but CI works in many countries and there are Indigenous peoples in there. So we also need to build the capacities of Indigenous peoples to engage with CI. As we are building the internal capacity of CI to engage with Indigenous peoples, we also need to get Indigenous peoples to the table. So we have a fellowship program that looks at young emerging leaders in Indigenous communities, and we provide them with a little bit of training and a little bit of support so they can do concrete projects with their communities and then elevate their leadership status. So this is what we have been doing.
You have brought really important issues that why Indigenous peoples need to be looked and be treated as a partner in the conservations. You also rightly said that Indigenous peoples are the guardians of the natural resources and biodiversity and maintaining ecosystems. But often, the Indigenous peoples are continuously facing threats when it comes to protecting their land and forest. What is your say in this?
Yes, that is very true. And conservation organizations have a lot to answer for. They have done a lot of negative things to Indigenous communities, but we should also recognize that there is changing. there are changes happening, and the discussion with conservation organizations is advancing. More and more, they are realizing that they cannot do this fortress conservation anymore. They have seen that these are not sustainable. They have seen that more conflicts arise when you prevent people from using the resources that they have stewarded for many, many generations. So there's this small, but I am sure very, very important steps that are being taken by conservation organizations to correct that wrong. So I think there's less fortress conservation being done now, and there is more like, okay, let's see how we can work. Admittedly, conservation organizations are still very, very slow in making these changes, and they're not using their influence with governments, because at the end of the day, it's the governments who make the policies. But conservation organizations can use their influence on governments to change policies so that the rights of the people who have been living in these forests or who have been utilizing the marine resources will be protected. I think conservation organizations have a long way to go there. This is because they are so dependent on governments to be able to continue working in some of the countries where we work in. So that's one area that we need to push the conversation. And if Indigenous peoples and conservation organizations work together, I am sure governments will eventually have to listen. But I think we haven't gotten to that point yet of governments and Indigenous peoples working together at the policy level.
I believe the Conservation International does not take any case related to Indigenous peoples being evicted from their land or the forest. But I know for sure that you have come across with such cases that Indigenous peoples being displaced from their land and forest in the name of conservation or wildlife reserves and so forth. If you have to, could you please share some of the examples that you have come across with such cases?
My years in CI has been 4 years. I haven't received any complaints about people being evicted from their lands because of protected areas. There have been some discussions about Indigenous peoples being limited to some of the resources, the gathering of resources. For instance, the hunting of certain animals, which are traditionally food for Indigenous communities. So these are the types of complaints, conversations that I have received. And I have actually seen more of the positive. I've seen how in some areas, CI has actually worked with the traditional leaders and really utilized traditional systems in conservation. And they have adopted that, and they have elevated that to wider, outside of the community, and made it wider. So that is one of the things that I've seen, that there are some projects in some countries that have been very good at recognizing traditional knowledge. There have been some missteps, and I think this is arising from not fully understanding Indigenous cultures. So there has been some prevention, for instance, of hunting a certain animal. And so the Indigenous peoples had to explain that this is part of their rituals and everything. So yes, I haven't had any reports of people being evicted, at least in CI projects.
In Nepal, there are many instances of violence against Indigenous peoples in the name of conservations, national parks, and reserved areas. The statistics puts that almost 24% of the total land in Nepal is the conservation land, including 12 national parks, 1 wildlife reserve, 1 hunting reserve, 6 protected areas, and 13 buffer zones. In each conserved and protected areas, there is a conflict between Indigenous peoples and the park officials. In this context, I want to know that whether or not the government has any responsibility towards indigenous peoples or the locals in respect to protecting of their rights in conservations or protected areas.
Of course, it's the government's responsibility and obligation, not just under national law, but also international law, to ensure that people should not be evicted from their homes and their resources. So, yeah, and it's very sad that this is happening. And maybe I should clarify that while I was in CI, I have not received complaints about CI specifically, but I have heard a lot of complaints about other conservation efforts and that are still ongoing. And I fear that there will be more of the same, especially as we move out of the COVID, when we are doing the recovery from the pandemic. Governments will have all the reasons to enter the territories of indigenous peoples simply because it's in the territories of indigenous peoples where there are resources. And governments will always say that these resources are necessary for the national good or for national reconstruction. So we should be very well prepared to, to confront this coming problem after the pandemic.
You rightly said that under international laws, the government has obligations. If you have to give a list of some of the obligations, what those obligations would be, Minnie?
Well, first and foremost, there's the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that recognizes that, I will not even say that, the most important right of indigenous peoples to their lands and resources. If you take away our lands and resources, you take away our identity, you essentially erase us. So this is a very, very basic right. And we can use all of the other conventions, even the Convention Against Genocide, because it's essentially genocide what you are doing if you take away the very basis of our cultures, of our lives, and that is lands and resources. So this is a very basic human right, and all governments have signed on to that, that all peoples have the right to survive, to live. And the particularity of indigenous peoples is we need our lands, waters, and resources to survive as distinct people. So if you take this away, you may not kill us directly, but eventually the result is the same, the loss of our cultures and the loss of our identities.
International law provisions that government or the private entity should secure free, prior, and informed consent with indigenous peoples before undertaking any development projects in their land, forest, or declaring any forest to conservation areas. How do we understand, or how we understand indigenous people's right to free, prior, and informed consent?
Well, it's simply because government refuses to recognize land rights. Right. So that is one very specific right of indigenous peoples in recognition of their long-standing ownership over the lands and resources that they are in. So there's that provision for free, prior, informed consent, wherein it says before any activity happens on the lands or waters of indigenous peoples, they're free, which means there should be no coercion. They're prior, which means it should be done way ahead of the development or activity. And informed, meaning all the necessary information, both good or bad, should be provided to the communities before they can get a consent. And consent means, people will say, yes, we agree to this project. And that's a very important right and a process for indigenous peoples, because it is a right for us, but at the same time, it is a process, which means that it's so easy to just go to a community and says this is a project, and they can do it in Nepali or any indigenous language, so they can say, oh, we provided you with the appropriate information. But is that consent? If you do not give the community the time and the space to discuss it, then it's not consent. There may be no military around them when they come and say, this is the project. There may not be obvious intimidation, so people will say yes. But if people do not have access to education, to health, then they will look at this and say, okay, this will bring in education. So we say yes. So that again is not consent, because they are being coerced to say yes, because they are not on equal footing with the proponent. So when I say it is a right and a process, the process is that Indigenous peoples have to be brought up to the same level as the proponent before you can have consent. Because no matter how good the information is, no matter how advanced the information was given, if the indigenous communities are not on the same footing as the company, because the company is holding a piece of paper saying they have gotten the approval of the national government to do this, and the communities do not have any piece of paper recognizing their rights to stay in that land, then it's not an equal discussion. So there is no consent if the whole process has not been observed. And it is very important that free prior informed consent is not a one-time process wherein you come in, you check the boxes. I talked with women, I talked with the youth, I've talked with the elders, and they all said yes. No, free prior informed consent is one, it's a collective process and a collective decision. Everybody in the community has to have a say. Two, it is an iterative process. It means it is relationship building. It's not, I said yes, goodbye, I'm going to do my mines and goodbye. No, it has to be an ongoing process and dialogue. So, for instance, if a dam is being built and they said yes, the consultation still happens, so that when there's a change, then the community can say, no, that's not how we want it, it has to be there. So again, free prior informed consent is not a checkbox ticking exercise, but a relationship building.
Why do you think the indigenous peoples are having conflict between indigenous peoples and government in conservation areas? What is your experience and perspective?
For indigenous peoples, for as long as government insists that the forests are the property of the government, and the people who have been living and relying on the forest do not have any rights over them, then that conflict will always be there. It is an issue of power. Government has the power because it has all the resources. It has declared all of these lands and other resources as property of the government, and indigenous peoples do not have that. We only have our power in the sense that we hold on to our relationship with the land. We prove that relationship by our existence, but government does not recognize that. It wants to have pieces of paper saying that this land is our land, our indigenous people's land. So for as long as that power dynamic exists, and for as long as government refuses to recognize the land rights of indigenous peoples, then there will always be conflict. And mind you, conservation organizations should really do something about promoting the recognition of land rights. It should go beyond saying that, indigenous peoples are the best conservers of nature, so we should work with them. First and foremost, what we should be doing really is demanding government to recognize something that is so obvious, that has already been done so many, many years ago. I mean, indigenous communities have existed before governments existed. And this is something that governments have to accept, that they will never do that until there's a push from both conservation organizations and indigenous peoples.
While talking about conservation and indigenous peoples, the term the inclusive conservation has been popular. Means that the indigenous peoples or the indigenous peoples participation in conservation management. Could you please elaborate this concept of inclusive conservation?
Because we have a project called Inclusive Conservation. What do we mean by it? It means flipping the coin. Before, conservation was happening, as you said, fortresses were being built, people were being evicted for conservation. But with inclusive conservation, what we hope is to change that and put people at the center and say it's people doing the conservation. It is getting the indigenous peoples to actually determine and lead conservation work. So this is the project that we're doing. We hope to highlight good examples of indigenous peoples actually, I hate the word conservation, but that's the term that's being used. But it's really how indigenous peoples are really managing their lands very effectively to meet their housing, their food demands. And this is what we want to show, that conservation can happen with people. It can happen with people changing nature, or the natural landscape, because they need to plant trees, they need to plant rice. And this is what we want to show, that people planting or utilizing the forest is not destroying the forest. We want to show that the traditional ways of indigenous peoples to use the land is in effect a very good conservation measure. So this is what we mean by inclusive conservation, is to include people in the conservation discussion and not to exclude them, which was the traditional way of doing conservation, is to exclude people. And that's very unnatural, because the natural order of things is people interacting with nature to come up with very well conserved resources.
Minnie, we have come to the almost end of the show. At last, if you have anything to add on or emphasize on at last, please.
There is one point that I would like to stress, that indigenous peoples, because of their past experiences with conservation organizations, tend to shy away, or do not want to have conversations with conservation organizations. And I totally understand that. But we also have to realize that with climate change, with biodiversity loss, I think we need, as indigenous peoples, to build more alliances. We need to get more people on our side. And I think it is very logical for indigenous peoples to try and work with conservation organizations. So let us try to dialogue with conservation organizations. We can always ask them to accept or acknowledge the errors that they have done in the past, but we should also move beyond the errors from the past and see where we can work together to save the only earth that is there for us. So we need the help of others, not just of indigenous people.
Lastly, I would like to request you to give a short message to the world's indigenous peoples in relation to conservation, please.
Keep on. The struggle goes on.
Thank you so much, Minnie, for your time and esteemed thoughts that you shared in relation between indigenous peoples and conservations.
Thank you so much. Yes, thank you.
Okay. To the end of the show, and today in this episode, I have invited Minnie Degawan from Philippines. She is serving as the director of Indigenous Peoples Program at the international organizations, which is based at the United States non-profit environmental organization called Conservation International. Next week, I will come up to discuss on different issues with different guests. If you have any queries, or feedbacks in regards to the program, you can reach me at indigenoustelevision@gmail.com. By then, have a nice weekend. Bye bye. Namaste.